recently, and the recently means October 27th, in the journal Science online. And so just for everyone watching and listening to know, there's two journals in the world, Science and Nature, that are regarded by scientists in virtually every discipline as the pinnacle of scientific publication. And so if you're a career scientist and you publish in Science or Nature, that's a career-making publication. It's the equivalent of a bestseller, let's say, or a hit movie in the scientific community. And both Science and Nature are among the oldest of scientific journals and the most prestigious, and they had their origin in the UK. And so everyone in the scientific community has been for decades very impressed with Science and Nature. So I'm telling everyone that just so you know the significance of this publication outlet. Now, there's an article there that was written by John Cohen on October 27th, 22, talking about this Senate investigation that Matt just referred to. And let me read a little bit about this. The mysterious origin of the COVID-19 pandemic, like so many aspects of the response, has created deep divides along party lines in the United States. Okay, so that's the opening statement. And so basically, the opening statement is designed to convince both the writer and the reader that the primary issue here with regards to the lab leak hypothesis is one of politics and not of fact or science. And then the article continues, many virologists and evolutionary biologists who have studied the origins of outbreaks dismiss the lab leak hypothesis. Many virologists, let's say, but other scientists have complained that the possibility was too readily downplayed. Okay, so there's this dispute. But then the writer continues, and it has become increasingly popular among conservative media outlets and some Republican politicians. So instantly politicizing it again. Now, this Senate report, which is reported here as a minority staff, concludes in its 35-page report, that the COVID pandemic was more likely than not the result of a research-related incident. And then the author immediately jumps to this statement, which is, that conclusion stands in sharp contrast to that of other panels, including from the World Health Organization and US intelligence agencies, which have deemed a zoonotic jump more likely or remain neutral, given the lack of direct evidence on the origin of the virus. Okay, so we're being enjoined by the journal Science itself to assume that all of this discussion about the origin of the lab leak is somehow politicking. Okay, so let's take that apart for a minute. So that's predicated on the assumption that the Republicans and the conservatives, let's say, both narrowly and more broadly, have something specific to gain, right, in a power-related manner by advancing the claim that the origin of the virus was, in some sense, a lab leak. And for the life of me, I can't understand why that's political. It's like it was either a lab leak or it wasn't. That's pretty damn evident. And it isn't obvious to me that the facts stand on one side of the political divide or another. So then I'm wondering, why in the world is it that Science magazine is publishing an article claiming that the real reason that anybody's concerned about whether or not this was a lab leak is because of Republican Party shenanigans? And so what do you think about that?
Well, it's true that America is very politically polarized. And there's a tendency in much of the media to see everything in a Republican versus Democrat lens these days. That doesn't work for the rest of us who aren't Americans. We don't have to see the world that way. We can think of it as a scientific question rather than a political question. It's true that early in the pandemic, a Republican president, Donald Trump, kept saying it might have come from a lab. Well, we happen to know that a number of scientists privately agreed with him but didn't say so at the time. But the real divide here, and we see this on social media all the time, we get active debates about this going on. The real divide is not between people who think it was a lab leak and people who think it was a market zoonosis, But people who think that we haven't answered the question yet, and we need to keep looking at both hypotheses, what I call the open question side of the debate, which I'm on, which my co-author's on, which everybody who thinks a lab leak is possible thinks. I don't know anyone who thinks it's 100% certain it was a lab leak. And on the other side of the question are the case closed crowd who say, no, we can already rule out a lab leak for certain. And that seems to me immensely premature. And here's why. In the case of SARS, we were able to rule out a lab leak and know that it came over the market because we found the infected animal. We found the civet cat that had caught the virus from the bat and gave it to people. And we found the index cases. These were food handlers and chefs and people who were cooking civet cats. The chain of transmission was very clear. In this case, we've found no infected animals. We found no evidence in blood banks of previously infected people. We found nobody who looks like an index case. The only thing we found is that there was a concentration of early cases in that food market in Wuhan. And a number of scientists, the ones referred to in that John Cohen article in Science, regard that evidence that there were quite a lot of early cases in that market or near that market as so-called dispositive. In other words, we can close the case. We can go home, shut up the inquiry, and say we know for certain it came out of that. And the rest of us say, no, hang on, you haven't found an infected animal, you haven't found an early case. And by the way, we know why there was a concentration of cases in that market, because in the early days of the pandemic, if you had pneumonia and you went to hospital, they were told to consider COVID as a cause only if you lived near that market. So it's a circular argument. Of course, the early cases were near the market because that's the only place they were looking. It's like the drunk who says, I'm looking for my car keys under this street light because that's where the light is. Again, I'm not making the case that the market couldn't have been the place where it happened. I'm making the case that we can't definitively conclude that yet.
Well, you're making a stronger case. Well, you're making a stronger case than that, I would say, in some sense, because you're saying that when we've done similar things previously, we've been able to find animals who had that virus variant, and we just haven't been able to find those animals at all. So what you're saying is that the only evidence that it came from the market is that there are cases that were reported earlier that were associated with the market. But that's the only piece of evidence that it's coming from the market. And so I think it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're being cautious and underplaying the evidence that suggests that something is rotten in the state of Denmark, let's say. I mean,
it's slightly, the evidence, to be fair, the evidence is slightly better than that because there were a number of samples in the market that were taken that were positive for this virus. They were environmental samples, that is to say, doorknobs, countertops, sewage, things like that. They weren't animals or people. They were swabs taken.
Okay, right. So we know the virus was circulating there.
Exactly, but they're all but one of one strain of the virus, which is one of the early human strains. The other is the other human strain, and there's one swab that shows that one. But most of the other swabs for most of the other early cases of that one come from the other side of the river, the Yangtze River, as it happens. So it looks like one strain was certainly circulating in the market, and maybe the other. But it could easily have been circulating in people. There's no evidence that it was animals. Now, there's a slight concentration of those samples in one corner of the market, which is where animals were on sale. So that's perhaps suggestive.
Okay, well,
that's also where the toilets were and the mahjong clubs were and things like that. So, there's lots of other reasons why it might have been in that corner. But they tested 80,000 animals.
Is there any evidence of animal-to-animal transmission of this virus?
Well, since the pandemic began, animals like mink and deer have caught it and are transmitting it to each other. So yes, it is capable of transmitting in other animals. But
does it do it effectively?
Much less effectively than it does in people or monkeys or mice.
Okay, so that's a big problem, right? Because we have these trillions of viruses, and this variant, this COVID variant, doesn't transmit very well in animals, and so that also makes it incumbent upon the people who claim that it had an animal origin to explain that how, given that it isn't very transmissible in animals, and that the probability of a human transmitted virus is very unlikely, that puts additional constraints on the notion that this was an animal transmitted virus, right? Because it's not very good at doing that.
Yeah. I mean, remember, the one thing we do know about it is that it's originally a bat virus. It's these SARS-like coronavirus, sarbecoviruses, are found in horseshoe bats. They're not found in other kinds of bats or other kinds of animals. That's their natural reservoir. And in those bats, they're not particularly lethal, and they cause mainly an intestinal disease rather than a respiratory disease. And they use very different receptors. So something's happened to enable that virus to adapt to causing a respiratory disease in human beings rather than an intestinal disease in bats. Now, that something could have been an intermediate host, like a bamboo rat or something on sale in a market, or it could have been a humanized mouse in a lab. Because what the Wuhan Institute of Virology were doing, they were infecting humanized mice. Now, these are mice that have had the ACE2 receptor gene from human beings inserted into them in place of their own ACE2 receptor. So their lungs are expressing a particular protein that is only found in human beings. And so if you infect an animal, this mouse, with the virus, you're effectively testing how dangerous this virus is on human beings. Now, the worry here is that if one of those mice escapes, or if it bites a lab worker or something like that, we're dealing with a virus that's been trained in these mice and in human cells in the lab to infect human beings. And that's the concern with this kind of experiments. The mouse experiments were done at biosafety level 3. That's pretty good. That's a negative pressure cabinet, completely sealed, where the air is properly filtered before it can get out. But the human airway epithelial cell culture experiments, also done with the same chimeric viruses, were done at biosafety level 2 in some cases. Now that's where gloves and a mask. In fact, you don't even have to wear a mask at biosafety level 2. Now, if this thing was, if SARS-CoV-2 was in one of these human airway epithelial cell cultures, and at biosafety level 2, it's more likely than not that the researcher would have picked it up and might well have been asymptomatic. It's not a very severe disease in many people. And he might well have gone to the market. He might have gone to the Mahjong Club or something. And so something could have happened along those lines. The contortions you have to go through to say that we can close the case on this are pretty extraordinary. I mean, for a start, you've got to assume that the Chinese are telling us everything we need to know about the early cases. Were some of the early cases lab workers? The CIA says they were. They won't give us the evidence as to how they know that. The Chinese say they weren't. The South China Morning Post reported that the earliest case was a man who caught it in November the 17th, 2019. Well, since then, the official Chinese, that was based on a leaked document, the official Chinese have disavowed that document, said, no, the first case was in early December. Well, we don't know. Now, if this was in the West, we would be all over this. The media would be all over this, demanding more transparency. And yet, the extraordinary thing is, we don't hear much criticism of the Chinese regime over this. We don't hear it at the G7 or what's called the COP27 meeting. We hear criticism of China quite rightly over their treatment of Hong Kong and the Uyghurs. But this, to me, is an even more scandalous thing, that 20 million people, or nearly that, may be dead, and an awful lot of people have had their lives turned upside down. And we know where it started, and we know there are two possible things that could have happened there, and we're not doing anything to try to push back against the regime's lack of transparency.
And we're continuing to engage in gain-of-function research.
Yes, and in cities too. My co-author Alina Chan makes the point that we shouldn't be doing this kind of research in cities. You should, if you're going to have a lab doing this kind of work at all, it should be in an isolated area.
Yeah, like Mars.
Like Greenland or Mars.
Yeah.